Elvis.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, evening to everyone. Hi, Susan. Welcome back to another.
I can't hear you, Zahra.
Oh, can you hear me now? Hi, Susan. Can you hear me?
Hi, Zahra. I can't hear you.
All right, let me see what is happening. One sec. Can you hear me now? Anything? Hi, Susan. No. Go on. I'll be right back.
Hello, everybody. I don't know whether you can hear me, but we seem to be having some technical difficulties. So just stay with us and we'll be back.
Can you hear me
Zahra.
now?
I can hear you perfectly now. I don't know what happened then.
Yeah, I don't know either. Welcome back to another weekly book chat. I'm Zahra from Collapse Life. We have Susan from Courageous Conversations, and we're very happy to see everyone who's joining us today. We're in our last and final week discussing what has been a really very interesting book by Dmitry Orlov called Reinventing Collapse. And this week we're looking at his final chapters, which looked a little bit at how to adapt or mitigate during collapse, and what we're calling resistance, but he framed it in very different ways. Kind of how did people react in the USSR at the end of the empire, and what are the similarities and differences to what we're experiencing now, especially here in the USSA, but also in Europe. I think things may be happening in different forms, but globally, there's no escape from what's going on. So, Susan, how are you? How was your week?
Yeah, I'm good, and my week was good, and this is a very timely conversation, especially for me in the UK, who's getting lots and lots of articles and news about what's happening in America, recognizing it's a big place and there are pockets of things going on, and there are places where it's quiet and nothing's going on. So I'd be really interested in your view on that, because I'm hearing a lot about resistance, and our audience, our lovely community who's joining us today. Any thoughts from you about resistance and what's happening?
Yeah, I'm down here in Texas, and for me, what's happening across the country, I'm getting it through the same filters as you are, through news headlines and blogs and videos that are being shared online. So, for us in our daily lives here, even though we live on the border, we're not seeing anything remotely like what we're seeing in the news headlines in terms of protests and whatnot. So that's really all I can say is what I'm seeing is pretty much the same as what you're seeing. But it brings an interesting point, actually, looking back at the book, because what Dmitry Orlov wrote about in the book is that there wasn't really a mass organized protest movement in the USSR. Where people resisted was much more at a personal level and in a private way. The loss of trust in institutions and in the government happened over time, to a point where it really was reduced to zero. And in that time, people built their own informal networks, and they started to barter, and they grew their own food, and they repaired what they had. And so they built a resistance, so to speak, an immunity to that collapsing system across time, and in a very kind of quiet way.
Yeah, I think that's my understanding of it, is that they didn't confront the system head on. In fact, Dmitry's quite dismissive of people who march and protest. And, I've seen that a lot, people saying that when we protest and we march, we are just fulfilling part of the theatre that goes on? Are we actually making any difference? And, as somebody who was there when we walked around London, for nearly 1 million of us, about Stop the War, it changed nothing. In Iraq, it changed nothing. So my faith in actual marching is probably about the same as protesting, is about the same as Dmitry. But there are other things going on, and he was sort of saying they worked around the system and they made it hard for the system to identify them. I mean, there was that film, wasn't there, where the old sort of the Stasi had to sort of put people on points duty to watch people and take notes and report back and have listening devices and all the rest of it. Whereas nowadays it's a lot sort of easier. So people were very creative, and he outlines that in the book, doesn't he, in terms of they were much better placed with the systems, the alternatives that we talk about. They had them, didn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. They the reliance on the personal network to get things done and to help each other out, I think, comes through really strongly through all the chapters of his book. And I don't know if it's by design or by default, but it feels as though here in the United States or in North America, that is not quite the case. We have our social networks for other reasons, and especially lately, even since he's written this book, our social interactions now happen so much more in the digital sphere than they do in real life, and that's to our detriment. I think that's really a vulnerability, and it comes through very clearly in the book. Who you knew really mattered in terms of your access to the things that you needed, and if that's not the case now, it's very difficult to start to build those in real life communities at this late stage. But it's about making yourself useful, and putting yourself in a position where you're making yourself known to others around you, that you have not so much declaring that you have things stockpiled. That's obviously not something that you would want to do in a collapse, but just, helping out a neighbor, letting them know who you are and what you're capable of, so that when an emergency happens, they can call on you, and that you can call on them as well. And that's, I think we talked about this before. That's kind of what happens naturally in more agrarian or more rural societies. But now that we've all become so urbanized and so disconnected and so locked into a convenience culture, it doesn't happen quite as easily anymore. So we have to actually make the effort to go through the steps to do that.
Yeah, I think more people are doing that. One of the things that I enjoyed in the book and found very thought-provoking was when he described the two different scenarios. So first scenario was you form a community, you get to know your neighbors, the people around you, you set up food links, you're all peace and love, and you're all getting on really well. And of course, that's very attractive. So other people come and join you, and you bonding, and the people who are not part of it drift away, and you're feeling really good that there you are prepared in your community. But as soon as the proverbial hits the fan, you're the first place that people go to.
Correct.
Because they know you're already set up. And his scenario number two, and this raised a really important question for me, was about how do you protect what you have. Scenario number two was that you're in an impoverished area and community that's already really creative. Crime, people don't wander into that area. The young are already pretty vigilant and astute and already know how to rob and infiltrate and work around the system. And that they already have a sort of black market, a protection system, and they're the ones who will come out better in a collapse scenario.
Yeah, you'd much rather be in the margins than in the mainstream when that sort of thing happens, because you're already prepared for anything. Every day is razor thin when you live on the margins. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody should become homeless overnight, but start to think in that way. I think he talks a lot about how you should be preparing yourself in advance. And one of the big lessons from the USSR is that things eroded slowly over time. And so people had that time to prepare for the inevitable, and to make do with less and to find ways to work around the system, because you knew you weren't getting anything certainly from the government or from the so-called institutions that were supposed to provide for you. That trust again went down to zero, and people just didn't even look for it anymore. I think there's still in North America a sense among a certain group of people, and probably a large, maybe majority group of people, that there are political solutions, there are economic solutions. We can vote our way out of this. We can fix this problem before it gets too big. And maybe that's true. I don't want to sound completely dark and say it's impossible. But if we prepare ourselves for the outcome that it's not possible, then we're going to be in better shape, because we will have mentally and physically prepared for that rather than being surprised by it. And he actually says that. He says that preparing ahead of time is a no regrets position to be in, because if it does happen, you're ready for it. You've built everything you need for that resilience. If it doesn't happen, well, you can sit back and smile and say, all right, well, I spent a little time preparing and I didn't need to, but yeah, no regrets in the end.
Yeah, I'll come back to that point in a moment. We've just had a comment from Christine, who says the manufacturing base was destroyed 40 years ago and created an entitled, soft consumer society who aren't interested in building networks. I think there's a lot of truth in that, certainly in the UK. The dependency, the feeling that other people will fix it, or that the government will somehow save us, as you were just saying, that whole outsourcing of, the everyday, it's not a necessity anymore, and therefore it's weakened us, hasn't it? It's really difficult to find that. And we will need to find that. I think that's one of the things that I've been considering. So going back to the point he made about the two different scenarios, made me think perhaps you need to get in touch with a gang or the criminal people, because they might be the most useful to you. But the other thing it made me think about, and I've been considering this for a while, is the role of violence, because one of the things that's happening in the UK and in America is the state is showing how it's not holding back, how it's very willing to use violence against its own people, which has always been true. And I think this is the shock that many people are in, that people are being killed out on their streets. Something that's happened in other countries over the years endlessly is now coming home. And, as Dmitry says, if you're prepared for that shock, if you accept that your government has a monopoly on violence and will use it, it's easier to understand, not condone or not feel compassion or be upset, but at least sort of see that, as in any apocalypse, all this is being unveiled.
It would be ideal if a silver lining that came out of what you just described is that we, the little people, band together and realize that it's a group of enforcers and elites against all the rest of us. And therefore, regardless of who we are, where we came from, what we wear, or whatever, we are at the same level and not fighting against each other. I think we are right now bifurcated. So yes, the state is using violence against people, but at the same time, people are looking at each other and saying, you're responsible for this, you're responsible for this. And so we're fighting against each other rather than uniting and recognizing where the real violence is coming from. I don't know if that's now changing or not here in the United States, but it definitely feels like that just continues to weaken us and make us more vulnerable when we're actually looking at scapegoating each other rather than just turning our attention to the system.
Yeah, that's part of the plan, isn't it? But I get the feeling that that is weakening as an argument. And I'm optimistic about the government question, because one of the things that happened to me during COVID was when I was looking at what was going on and experiencing and what was happening in the UK, I started to question the very role of government. And I mean, what we're talking about here about resistance, it's about power, isn't it? And our relationship to power and the social contract we have with government. And Dmitry mentions this in the book. Once the social contract has gone, when it's not providing, when the people of the Soviet were so used to everything being sort of provided and subscribed, and when that no longer was happening and the system was failing, then they started to question, well, why do we need this? And that's what saw collapse. And I think a lot of people are questioning the very role of government, because it's about how we organize ourselves and how we take care of each other and how we don't kill each other. And I don't think most people most people want to live in peace and be law abiding. But when the law stops making sense, then even they will question what's going on.
Well, yeah, we would hope. He talked about how normalcy sort of disappears in stages. So in the beginning, there's a lot of fear, and that's probably the stage that we're at. We fear the power elite. First, that fear goes away, then people lose respect for authority completely, and when that respect falls apart, then the elites start to lose their coherence and their legitimacy. And then you end up in the situation that the USSR was in, where it was people just sort of laughing at the structures and systems, recognizing them as completely hollow, Potemkin village, and then building the systems locally, personally, that they needed to be able to just survive. And I think that is a really interesting parallel, because we can look at those stages and see maybe where we are in that timeline.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think Dmitry says that it's the lack of imagination, isn't it? And that whole thing about if we are in a situation where old systems are being dismantled and not prevailing and doing what they're meant to be doing, we need to have the imagination to think, how can we do it differently? I mean, we're so conditioned and indoctrinated that we have to vote, that we have to put people in power. And I think all of that is now up for questioning. And I think that's such a good thing. If I'm going to draw a silver lining from any of this, then that would be one of the things. Oh, we've got lots of lovely comments coming in.
Yeah.
Do you want to read some?
Sure,
Zahra?
yeah. We have a comment from the Freedom Convo, the Riff Raff podcast. Evil wears itself out. Collectivism is dysfunctional by nature. It's a question of our preparedness to become resilient with the decline. And this is our friend David. David adds, tech and surveillance is the wild card here in terms of the timeline and where we are along that agenda. And I think he's absolutely right. And Christine Mose agrees. Exactly, Freedom Convo. Evil carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. That is a silver lining, if I've ever heard one. I love that. And that is true. And I think also that as human beings, we have the potential to be extremely resilient, extremely resourceful. We've proven that time and time again. I think we have to find that within ourselves, and we have to make that mental leap from being looked after to looking after ourselves and those around us. And I think this is where we don't have much time, but we have a little time where the structures still operate and we can still move around as we are used to in a sort of business as normal way. And if we can start thinking in terms of what might come next, we can prepare ourselves in the time that we have left. And I think he makes that point in the book that collapse creates that time and allows people to see who can tolerate what's coming and who can't.
Yeah, and of course I feel like we're preaching to the choir here, that we're a community who's been looking at this over time and thinking that it'll happen. And one of the things we mentioned last week is that whole AI, digital surveillance, that window is closing, I think. And so this is our moment, isn't it? That unless we resist and fight back in some way, shape or form, and it might just be non-compliance. One of the things that's been happening in the UK, because we've already had the sort of mandatory digital ID, which is backed down on, interestingly. Starmer, who shouldn't be in power, they have backed down on that. But I think, and again, Russia has digital ID and digital currency and is looking to bring that in. There's no difference over how they actually want to control us. So the more people who recognize what's going on, the more powerful we are in terms of turning our back, reimagining different ways of governance, and not supporting their systems in any way, shape or form. I think Snyder, I can't remember his other name, who wrote on tyranny, he's the 20 rules on tyranny. The first one is do not comply.
Yeah, Tim, I think you might.
Tim, that's it. Tim Snyder, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. Obviously, we all feel like do not comply is the right place to be. But I think there's also a certain amount of accepting the inevitable and learning how to work around it. So, for example, the digital ID rollout in the UK, there was a lot of clamor, there was a lot of noise, and it put the government on notice that people know what's going on. They're not just rolling over and accepting it. Now, whether that will actually stop it from happening, it's doubtful. It's going to happen anyway. But so I think, thinking that we'll be able to stop the behemoth is maybe not time well spent. I think we have to think that some of these things are going to happen, and as you pointed out, they're global. They're happening everywhere, even places like Russia, India. Never mind, it's happening everywhere. So there's nowhere really that we can escape what's happening now. There's no country that's going to be better off or worse off. It's going to happen in stages. But how do we manage within that? I think so. A certain acceptance of the new normal and recognizing what that's going to look like and how do I operate within that, I think is going to be really psychologically helpful.
I think you're right. And I think that's the whole premise of the book, isn't it, by Dmitry, is psychologically preparing yourself. And again, I think having these conversations, keeping ourselves informed of what the system is and what's going on. And it's interesting, I heard somebody talk the other day about comply to get by. Making a conscious decision about this is what I'll do, and I'm doing it for this reason. It might be to get food or not to have the jackboots at the door. Whatever reason it is, I think that has less cognitive dissonance and harm to yourself than feeling that you're pressurized to do something you don't want to do. So the more we are in control of the choices that we make, even though there might be choices that we don't want, that will help us survive these situations, as it did the Russians.
100%. I mean, so there's one position which is feeling that you're forced to do something that you don't want to do. There's another position which is rationalizing in your head that actually it is something that I want to do, and denying that little voice in the back of your head that says this is wrong. I think we saw a lot of that happening over the last 5 or 6 years during the COVID era, of people actually not anticipating how they might behave when XYZ happens. And then when they were faced with these choices, giving in, doing things that were counterintuitive or against what they thought they might have done if they had the time to think about it. But then rationalizing, no, it is the right thing to do. It's the best choice that I've made, blah, blah, blah. And then having to live with that later, you have to keep compounding the lie in order to survive beyond that crisis moment. I want to read, actually, I have it in front of me, an excerpt from Dmitry's book, which I think is relevant here. If you'll indulge me for a second. He says, in order to adapt, you will need plenty of free time. Granting yourself this time requires a leap of faith. You have to assume that the future has already arrived. Your lying eyes will be of little help here, so shut them tight. The old normal is that life will go on just like before. The new normal is that nothing will ever be the same. Your consolation is that even if the new normal never arrives, you will be well adapted for that too. So that, I think, ties together some of the things that we've been talking about. But this idea of free time and idleness versus being constantly busy and thinking that we're being productive is something that he really plays out as a difference, I think, in the Soviet mindset versus the North American mindset.
Yeah, there's a lovely book. I think it's by Hershey, about rest is resistance, about stepping out of the grind culture. And Dmitry says that, the whole American culture, so counter, because it's all about individualism and separation, whereas in Russia it was the collective. So if nobody was doing anything of any great effort, why should you? It wasn't going to get you anywhere. It wasn't going to get you extra points or up the ladder any further, unless you were part of the operations. And if you decided you didn't want to be part of that, then you were better just keep your head down and do as little as possible. And and I think I see people writing about that in the States, about not supporting the system, about people, whistleblowers, or just people, just that sort of whole sabotage thing, which people write a lot about, say, with the Norwegians in the Second World War, about that. Not only was non-compliance, but they actively sabotage things, not in a violent way, I don't think. There's probably examples of that, but they were very willing to put themselves courageously in the firing line, literally, by not supporting a system that they disagreed with.
So interesting. Yeah, he writes about how in the Soviet Union, they already had made room in their culture for idleness and for not focusing so much on careerism or so-called quote unquote success or overachievement. Overachievement was considered something actually negative and undesirable, whereas here in North America, everything is about, achieving more and more and more. So that made them a little bit more psychologically resilient to the idea of collapse, and being able to detach, he says, is really important for us to prepare, to stop striving and thinking about status and thinking about what other people might think of you, focusing just on what you need to get by and ignoring everything else, he says, is one of the most important things to prepare for or adapt to collapse. And he says that those people who are most steamrolled by collapse were middle-aged breadwinners who had tied their identity completely to work and advancement and forward motion, so to speak. Collapse completely stripped them of meaning. And in the Soviet Union, many of those people just turned to drink, suicide. I mean, it was very, very devastating for them. We do have some comments, so
Yeah.
we should make sure we don't miss them.
Yeah, let's go back to David at the Freedom Convo podcast. Oh, I've lost it. It's gone up. Can you read? Oh, I've got
I
it here. I've got it. It says vaccine mandates happen so they know anything can happen with enough terror or nudging units, weaponizing behavioral psychology, spiritual fortitude will be required. What may be coming. A good heart will keep us alive. Well said, David. You know, I've read and in my own experience, I think the whole COVID debacle was a dress rehearsal. They were just seeing how far they could go and testing us as to what happened, and tremendous lessons from that period, I'm sure, for all of us. And then Pat Brown says at 65, it seems my entire life, and especially the last 25 years, have been to develop navigation skills and find the loopholes. Brilliant. We have a 34-foot work bus in the driveway, and just recently a new young'un living with us on the property, and recently a new young'un living with us on the property. I'm envious. I think that's one of the difficult things in collapse, is the intergenerational stuff. The bus is tricked out with video conferencing and a hospitality bar. Don't tell us where you live, Pat, or we'll all be round. Conversations run to what do they do versus are they living in it? So the neighbours are diverted. Oh, interesting. You're obviously very well prepared. What about other people? What sort of things are you doing? What do you think about this comply to get by? And this whole area of resistance is fascinating. We'd love to hear more. These are great comments. Keep them coming.
Thank you, everybody, for the great interaction. We love these Sunday conversations. Just to close out, Pat also said, in my campaigns, one of the guidelines is a concept must have social capital before any political capital is expected.
Okay, and here's Rachel, one of my friends, and always wise and on the point. It's how they use the tech to perpetrate violence that we need to be really concerned about. And yes, we will come more together the more things unravel. I think that's true, but we can resist their tech, because when enough of us push back, there really won't be any more Mr. Nice Guy. Rachel continues, it's not just the threat of surveillance, digital ID that we need to be concerned about. It's the threat of tech violence, direct energy weapons, and frequency delivered via mobile phones. Whoa, that's a really good point. I read something yesterday, this sort of nanotechnology and this transhumanism and everything, how they can send waves or whatever they'll be able to do with the technology that could bring pain to people remotely, or they can do things such as constant noise, throw your brain cells out, and you're thinking, anything is possible. And it's scary stuff.
It is scary stuff, but I think that's part of the point. That fear is what motivated a lot of the behavioral nudging during COVID. And, when it comes to things like directed energy weapons or the sound weapons that create Havana syndrome and things like that, we know now that they exist, because there are people who have experienced the fallout from that, and yet there's nothing we can do about it. It's the same with the so-called geoengineering, the things that they're doing to manipulate the skies over our heads. We can see it. We know that it's been in the cards. The technology exists for decades. There's nothing we can do about it. And that makes us start to feel hopeless and helpless and maybe fearful. And those are all really negative emotions to be driving us right now. So I think it's a really interesting point, because of course the technology can and is being weaponized against us. And there are some things that we can opt out of, or we can say do not comply, but there are some things that we can't. If they're poisoning our skies or our water, or putting sound waves through the air, there's nothing we can do. You can't live in a Faraday cage all your life. So this is where I think, Orlov makes some really good points about the psychological preparedness. And then this is also where I think David alluded to, there's a spiritual component as well. And just having faith in one another, faith in God, just accepting that, we are here at this moment for a reason, and strengthening ourselves that way. I think that's more important to just overcome that fear. Go ahead, Susan.
Yeah, I know. I'm going to come back to a point Christine's making as well. I think there is a spiritual aspect to it. Is this part of our evolution that we are questioning what's going on and are taking more responsibility? And we are sort of, making huge changes that are necessary, because systems that have been corrupt and oppressive, we don't want them any longer. So this is a good sort of moment in history for all of us. And we don't know what will happen. And I certainly choose not to be fearful. And I think that's one of the things that's sort of part of the training to be in this community, isn't it? That there's nothing that we can do by being fearful. It will just debilitate us, make decisions difficult. And none of us know what will happen. We know this is a pivotal time. And let's go to Christine, who says complying perpetuates and advances the dark agenda, but not everyone is willing to do that. COVID was a stress test as well as global-wide behavioural conditioning. This is part of it. The thing that I've found most upsetting during COVID, and I think has relevance here, and certainly did in the Soviet Union, and Dmitry alludes to this, is I was really surprised how many ordinary people took it upon themselves to criticize other people, to shout at them in shops, to fight with them if they weren't wearing a mask properly, or, all of those sort of things. And you recognize, would people turn you in? Would they report you to the authorities? And, this is all part of the scare, isn't it? That what we mustn't do is, as you were saying earlier, Zahra, is fight amongst ourselves, see this as an individual battle. We need to come together. We need our strength, and our power comes from our cooperation with each other.
And having an attitude of live and let live as well, and not just replacing the police with, community police. I think we are responsible for our own behavior, and sometimes that social pressure keeps bad behavior in check, but it can also go too far. And Dmitry has an amazing, very brief anecdote in the book, buried somewhere in one of the middle chapters, but it really struck me. He talked about living here in the United States and being a member of a community garden where he lived. And
I remember that.
Do you remember this?
I do. That's why it's making me laugh. Yeah.
There are these activists who came in and started complaining that certain people were not showing up at the meetings, and they were not doing the communal work that was required of them to be a member. And why should these people be allowed to have a plot? Maybe they should be kicked out of the community garden. And he points out that many of the people who were not complying were actually Russians. And so they had this built-in just block about attending meetings or doing communal labor. They came from that culture that sort of said, no, I have my plot. I'm going to do my thing. I'm going to mind my own business, and I'm not going to take part in all this apparatus and this structural system. And it's written in classic kind of Dmitry Orlov language, so it does make you laugh or smile. But I think it's also a really interesting insight that we can sometimes be our own worst enemies.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that my husband studied was about natural law, and this whole thing about responsibility. And I have a responsibility, and you have a responsibility to how we behave and how we respect each other, and my freedom stops where yours starts, and those sort of things. So we still need rules, but not rulers. That's how, this whole thing about governance, and that's a lovely example from Dmitry, isn't it? And I see that in local organizations. Give someone a little bit of power, and they've got their clipboard and they're telling everybody about what they're doing wrong. And
We're
it's
all
that.
natural tyrants somewhere deep inside us.
Yeah, and that's where we have to change, as you
Mhm.
said, to be more accepting, to be more tolerant, to actually ask ourselves, does this contribute? Does this add value in any way? And
Mhm.
the Soviet example that Dmitry writes about is people had recognized that having managers and systems and surveillance and people checking on everybody was not a good use of energy and resources. And when it
Absolutely.
came to it, it was a lot simpler, and that's the sort of mindset that we need to have, isn't it? Is that life will be simpler, it will be raw, it will be challenging and more difficult, but we won't want complexity and people micromanaging everything.
Absolutely. I want to pop over because we have a few comments coming in from some of our viewers. So thank you, everyone. Sufi Bear 555 says, fascinating group dynamics. Um, Thumbs up to that. And then we have from Deepwater One, the Russia-Ukraine war strategy is to bankrupt the West to be able to afford to fund the war. If we outlast technocracy, it will, and not comply, it will go bankrupt as resources run out. That is the hope. Yes. And then they carry on to say chemtrails are to trap in greenhouse gases for global warming to open up Arctic ice. That's an interesting theory. It may be.
Yeah, who knows? That is possible. And, we're about halfway through. And I just wanted to say thank you for everybody who's joining us. We've got people coming from Rumble and BitChute and YouTube. And of course, this lovely community on Substack. Well, lovely community everywhere. So thank you. And yeah, we're all speculating about what's going on. And there are so many things that we'll never know the truth, but we're all trying to make sense. And we're all thinking about how does this affect us? And that is the big question, isn't it? About when do I resist? When do I actually have systems in place? Or how do I have systems in place that can support me in a system of government that is not supporting me, is not helping in any way?
I think one of the things that many of us are feeling is the tension of having one foot in the system and one foot out. And I think that David from the Freedom Convo um, is maybe an embodiment of that tension right now. He says, "I'm in college in healthcare education. Education is a unique battleground in the potential for collapse. It's very intense cultural metamorphosis, DEI, etc." And he says it's really stressful for people like me. Um, and so, David, if you want to add some more details on your experience in that regard, we're happy to share it. I know that we all have to continue to operate, and we don't know for how much longer we all need to operate within this system. So this is what creates this very strange friction of how long do I need to carry on with business as usual, or can I switch completely over to some kind of off-grid form of living? And I think that's very difficult to do. It's difficult to do both, but for a lot of people to just sort of check out of society completely and not be reliant on any of the systems, and therefore not need the digital ID or the energy or any of those things. It's a very difficult shift to make, to go completely off grid. And I know, Susan, you and your husband have been doing that kind of thing a little bit back and forth along that spectrum for a while. So you may have some insights into that as well.
Yeah, I think it's another good point. I think it's actually impossible to step outside the system. And I think one of the things that Dmitry writes about, or what I got from it, is that people in Russia were very willing to have the system provide housing for them and good transport, but they recognized the limitations of the system, so brought in things to add to the comfort and the way their lives worked themselves. And I think that's the big switch, isn't it, that's happening in the UK and in America, is people recognizing that they can't rely on the system any longer, and they've got to start doing things for themselves as much as possible. And that's a big change, I think, particularly in the UK, where we have, and going back to David's point about education, I think that's a really difficult place to be. I certainly know in the UK, my daughter worked in a school for a while, there's huge pressure and a lot of, just really driving people and teachers into the ground by statistics and reporting, and not a lot on education and in all the resources and the revenue cut. So yeah, I do appreciate that. And we've got another one from Pat who says, interesting on community gardens. As a co-founder and board president for 4 years of our city's first community garden, it was challenging to move folk together. The garden is still functioning, but with an ebb and flow depending on the skill set of the leaders. Yeah, it's a good point, Pat. You know, that leadership, facilitation skills, not leadership power down, but power with. It's a totally different model that we're going to have to find and have the skill set for.
Just going back to some of what Dmitry had written about, just again around that example that he gave of the community garden, he wrote that ideology makes people dangerous, and those are actually the people to stay away from in any pre or post collapse system. Groups with really strong identities and very rigid beliefs are very easily turned violent, he wrote. And the most dangerous people are not the people who are passive, but the people who are activists, who are determined to organize and then enforce a vision. And it may seem like a vision that you agree with, but anything that's being forced through rigid ideology is just not going to be the place that you want to be in, especially if that's exactly what the resistance is trying to protest. And I don't think that that's what Pat Brown is necessarily describing, but there's always in any group the potential for that. And it's definitely something that Dmitry recognized and warned against. He says, avoid organized political mobs. Even well-intentioned movements can radicalize, turn inwards, and consume their own.
Yeah, I think that's the danger, isn't it? You could, that's what seems to have happened in various revolutions. If you look at the history of them, they get rid of one group of oppressors and institute another group who can be equally as nasty and violent. And so it's very difficult, isn't it, to actually know how we can change this and what to have in place instead. And, even if we can't sort of get a gardening group to work together.
Yeah.
Well,
And this is the thing, because those are the systems that we always talk about, having that communal resilience. It will require working together. It will require having things like community gardens and sharing, so that I don't have to grow every single input that I'm going to need to survive. Maybe I grow tomatoes in an abundance and you grow wheat, and then we can trade and barter amongst ourselves. But if we can't get over, I live slightly differently than you, or I see things slightly different than you, we'll never be able to manage. We'll all just be doomed. Survival is going to require acceptance. It's going to require a sense of accepting other people's diversity, but also just recognizing what we need each other for.
Yeah, I'm a great believer in necessity is the mother of invention, that when we need each other, things will change dramatically. And that'll be a hard shift for some people. And we will need some good leadership. And, people will turn to those people who are calm, who are resourceful, who've prepared themselves, which is another reason, isn't it, to have these conversations. So we've got more coming in. I think it was David who says about 4 years with a master's, prepped human resources. President was the best time. Not quite sure about that one, but I'm sure there's lots that David could tell us about his experiences.
I think I invited him to kind of add some more details about what he was going through. And he shared that students at his college were not told that COVID vaccines were no longer a requirement in his province in Canada, and therefore they all took them. So these are students studying in a healthcare field. They all took the COVID vaccines, even though they didn't know that it wasn't necessary. He said, therefore, they all took them, if not already, except me. I'm the only one who knew that. And then he is saying that there's a lot of of the DEI mentality, that diversity, equity, and inclusion that's prevailing in healthcare. Men can be women. Everyone is mentally ill, he says. UN propaganda on the walls, women's products in the men's room.
Wow, that's yeah, there is so much there, isn't it, to unpack. This is all part of it. And interestingly, that leads us on in a way, because we said this was the last week that we were going to be talking about Reinventing Collapse by Dmitry Orlov. And it's been a very thought-provoking and interesting discussion, and I really appreciate that from everybody. And we're going to move on to do another book next week, and what's happening in healthcare, what's happening in education is going to be very relevant to this next book that we've got coming up. Do you want to say a little bit more about it, Zahra?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a book called The Global Coup d'etat, and it's by a Swedish researcher called Jakob Nordengard. And he's done some incredible work in terms of researching and laying out the the moment that we find ourselves in has been built over decades by a number of different groups and entities and NGOs and the United Nations itself. And Jakob has done great work tracing all of that and building it all. He's written a book about the Rockefellers. He's talked about the Trilateral Commission, all of these organizations and their interconnections, how they were built, how they were funded, and how they led to the moment that we're in now. The Global Coup d'etat he wrote more recently, but within the past few years. But even then, a lot has moved on since he put it down on paper in terms of actually implementing this global reset. And so we're going to be talking about a few of the chapters within this very big tome that he's written that really focus on the great transition, the great reset, all the different plans and scenarios that have been concocted at very high global levels that we're actually seeing now in our real life. And so it'll help to kind of pin together some thinking around what's happening now, what happened over the last couple of years, and what might be coming, and just kind of put us all in the context of how it's not happening by accident.
No, and it has relevancy to quite a few of the things that we've mentioned today and also in the last few weeks. Another interesting comment from Christine. She says, the compliant are not benign. In their eyes, we are an existential threat and cannot be reasoned with. Yeah, I think that there's some truth there, that it was very divisive. And yeah, we were a threat. We were killing grandmas in the UK if we didn't comply. And people were very vicious in some of their responses. So yeah, it's not good. And we do need to keep informed, and we need to keep ourselves strong and well, don't we, in all of this. And I think the book that we're going to be covering next week is about this sort of preparedness, isn't it? Understanding what we're up against. Pat asked you to repeat the name of the book. I think it's The Global Coup d'etat.
That's correct. Yeah.
We'll put a link. We'll put a link up when we send the this talk out. We'll put some links this weekend. And again, it's not necessary to have read the book. I doubt if we're going to read the whole book. Well, I don't think I will, because I'm going on holiday. And it was 458 pages long. It's packed. Someone said it was like an encyclopedia.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one of the things that that Jakob has done a great service in, because it is encyclopedic and you can read it as such. You don't have to read it from start to finish. You can kind of jump in different chapters and read it as though it's a reference book. It lays out, as I said, organizations, individuals, movements, power flows, money flows. So yes, we encourage everybody to join us for the conversation. And if you get a chance to quickly skim some of his writings or get a copy of the book and look through, you'll be able to kind of keep up. But it's not necessary to have read the whole book to be with us. And so we really appreciate everybody who joins us for these as always. Yeah, just as a reminder as well. So we have on the Collapse Life podcast coming up a conversation with Jacob Nordengard coming, I believe, in a week's time. And so people can learn a little bit more about who he is and what motivated him to do this work by watching that next week. And we'll certainly be sharing all that out on our Collapse Life channels. So hopefully everybody is subscribed. And if not, you can just easily do that at collapselife.com. And as Susan said, we will share a link to find his book and his other writings. He's on Substack as well. So yeah, I think you'll all find him very interesting.
Yeah, very relevant. It's very well researched. And it brings together a lot of the different subject areas. And the main learning for me is how long all this has been going on.
Exactly.
This is not a recent thing. This is a long time in our history, subjugation of ours as a people. And, this is what we need to understand, isn't it? And I look forward to that conversation. And please let us know, anybody in the chat, any final sort of comments, anything you want to say about this talk that we've been having together.
I'll just quickly shout out as well that everybody should also find Susan's Courageous Conversations and be sure to subscribe to that as well, because it's a fantastic community that she's building on her Substack. And I hope everybody follows along. And one of the great things that Susan does is she shares poetry of resistance. And it's a really wonderful balm for the soul.
Yeah, because thank you, Zahra. And I think that we need beauty, we need poetry, we need art. Dmitry doesn't mention a lot about that in the book, but it was part of their cultural revolution. It was part of how people dissented, and they weakened the whole myth by books like Dr. Zhivago and what was the Gulag Archipelago, which I remember being very shocked by. Totally dismissed this sort of utopia vision that everything was fine in Russia. So yeah, poetry, art, we're all creative, and we need to be more so, don't we? So any final comments from our community out there?
Yeah. Well, we thank everybody for joining us, and we really look forward to seeing you again next week. We do, if you can't join us live, we do share the video recaps, so you can always watch them later on at your leisure. But we just really appreciate everybody who came and joined this discussion with us, and we look forward to seeing you back next week. Susan, have very safe travels on your way to vacation. Wise choice to go away right now.
Yeah, well, the weather's pretty grim here, so it'll be nice to be somewhere different. And everybody have a good week, and I look forward to seeing you next week, Zahra. Thank you, everybody.
Too. And just before we go, Christine had one last comment, which is that these chats are like a balm on the soul. And she was literally typing those words as I said them out loud around your work, Susan. So thank you, Christine. We love having you with us, and we will see you all again next week.
Goodbye.
Bye for now.